Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. This is part E of lecture 6 on descriptive statistics and Islamic approach. In the past few lectures, we have been studying the decline of infant mortality across countries in the 20th century. In this lecture, we will try to use this data to evaluate the performance of different countries and discover which countries have done well in this dimension. As we have studied earlier, you cannot do ranking on a purely objective manner. The only way to do ranking is when you have a purpose. So our first object will be to discuss and explain why we want to do rankings of countries in terms of infant mortalities. As we have discussed, you cannot rank countries on multidimensional characteristics without having a goal. So the goal of our trying to evaluate countries on infant mortality is to try to study who has done well so that we can study the health policies that they have followed and implement them across the world to try to get big reductions in infant mortality. Meta principle is that data analysis provides us with clues about the real world, and then we have to follow up these clues by studying the real world. The data itself is never complete and is not sufficient to analyze data. You always have to go back to the real world. And in terms of these clues, sometimes the clues are false and misleading, and sometimes they are valid. And sometimes the only way to distinguish this is to go to the real world to see whether or not the clue is indicating something real or not. So we consider the problem of how we can rank the countries in terms of progress in eliminating or reducing infant mortality. So one very simple possibility is to look at the infant mortality in 1960 and compare it with 2018 and just take the difference. How many more lives are being saved? So the one problem with this strategy is that 1960 statistics are not available for many countries. The series starts later. So one solution to this is to, instead of using the 1960 statistics, just use the maximum value over the whole data set. So that is the worst case performance, and then you look at today's performance, and the more the difference, the better the country, the more reduction in infant mortality it achieved in numbers. So when we actually carry this out, we calculate this value for all the countries, and then we sort the countries according to this criteria. It turns out that Yemen is the top ranked country. Now this is a little bit odd because Yemen is a war-torn country over the last few years, and the value in 2018 should be quite high. The data says that it starts at 279 and it ends around 42.9, but this 42.9 value has been repeated over the last 10 years as if there has been no change. The likely guess is that this data has been interpolated because the war does not allow us to get actual data. Another problem with this method is that all of the top 5 countries have infant mortality above 200. This method is not really identifying the countries who have done well so much as identifying countries which started out very badly, because any country which started out badly will end up doing well because all of the countries have progressed, as we have seen. So the reason that the difference is not doing well for us as a criteria is because if some country was terrible, like if it had IM 500 and this reduced to IM 250, then this country is the worst of all time, but the difference in reduction is the greatest of all time. What actually happened is that the worst country had 222 infant mortality in 1960 and 85 in 2018. So the difference is 137, which is a very large difference. So the very worst country, which has performed worst all over time, turns out to have an excellent performance in terms of this criteria. On the other hand, if some country goes from 105 to 14, which is actually means that it was in the 50th percentile, it was median, and now it went to first percentile. So it means that it overtook about 25% of the countries. This only has a much smaller difference, and it doesn't compete with the worst country. So the point is that there's not space enough near the bottom, so that if you're starting out with a good infant mortality and you do much better, still the difference will be small. And if you are a terrible country and you just manage to improve a little bit, your difference will be high. So this difference in infant mortality does not give us a good measure of the improvement in the countries. One solution is to switch to proportional change. So instead of looking at the absolute number of deaths reduced, if you go from 222 to 85, don't look at the number of deaths reduced, that's 137. Look at the proportional change. So if you look at 137 over 222, that's a reduction of 61% in mortality. But if you go from 105 to 1, that's a reduction of 99%. So now, even in the lower ranges, you can get good performance. If you want to look at the proportional change, you can look at the log of the infant mortality in 2018 divided by the maximum infant mortality, and this will give you a measure of the proportion. Doing this gives you better results. But there is a third method, and we will think about this a little bit more later. But there is a third method we can use, which is that we want to know how many countries did a country overtake, how many countries did it do better than. So it's a sort of a comparative measure. So, for example, if a country goes from the median to the best, then it overtakes 50% of the countries. That's a pretty impressive performance. The list of the top countries by the proportional change criteria. This criteria gives a better chance for the already good countries to appear. If a country has IM equals 8, it's very good. But if it reduces to IM equals 1, that's an 800% reduction, and that will put it in the running for the best. In the previous criteria, the good countries don't have a chance to appear in the top 10. So to capture this directly, we can just switch from infant mortality to the ranking. We just rank the countries according to how well they have done. From 1 to 195, there are 195 countries on which we have data. So the worst country is 195 and the best country is 1. And then we look at how this rank changes over time. So if the 195 countries goes to 100, that's a big performance because it has changed 95 positions in ranking. If 195 goes to 195, it was the worst, it remains the worst, and it has no gain in performance, even though if you look at the absolute reduction in infant mortality, that would be quite large. So by measuring the change in rank instead of the change in number of infant mortality, we can get a better measure of performance of the countries. This table shows how the switch from looking at reduction in absolute count of infant mortality and switching to the difference in ranks affects the ranking. So here is the ranking in terms of absolute numbers. The top 6 countries are Yemen, Oman, Maldives, Egypt, Nepal, and Afghanistan. How did we come up with this? We looked at the maximum infant mortality, which was 279 for Yemen, and the 2018 figure, which was 42, and the difference is 236, which is the highest in the whole data set of 193 countries. Oman is the second, and it had infant mortality of 216, which improved to 9.8. It was pretty good. So Oman did quite well, and its change is 206. Similarly, Maldives did quite well. It had a terrible maximum 210, and it improved to 7.4, and so on. So these are the top 6 countries. If you look at the ranks, this doesn't tell the same story, because the rank of the countries, the maximum rank of the maximum is 193. Yemen is the worst of all the countries, and in 2018 its rank is 165. That's a significant improvement, but only about 30 places, 28 places. So it's not doing all that well. As opposed to that, Oman goes from 190 to 72nd place. So that's quite a big reduction in rank. Maldives goes from 184 to 60th place. That's even better. Egypt, now it goes from 185 to 112. That's about 60 places, 65 places. And that's decent. Nepal goes from 189 to 134. That's not as good. Similarly, Afghanistan's performance, which looks good in absolute terms, doesn't look so good when you look at the reduction in ranking. So here are the top 10 countries when we look at the rank according to the maximum infant mortality and the rank according to 2018. And then we look at the difference. These countries have been sorted by the difference in rank. So it turns out that Maldives is the top. It had rank 184 in terms of maximum, quite close to the bottom, 193, but not at the bottom. And then it had rank 60 in 2018, and so the difference in ranks is 124, and this is the largest possible change in this data set. Oman comes in second. It had rank 190 in terms of the maximum, and then it went to 72 in 2018, and so it had rank 118. The difference was 118, which is the second highest. Turkey now comes in with the new country. It started out at 170 and moved to it started out at rank 170 and moved to 71, which is a difference of 99 places. It overtook 99 countries in rank. Libya has also done well, going from 168 to 75, and so on. One interesting thing to note is that all of these countries are badly ranked in terms of the maximum. They all had very high maximum. So the problem that we had to begin with hasn't really been solved a lot. Many of the countries are the same. They all started out badly, and that's obvious, because if you start out at rank 193, you are the worst, then you have a lot of room to improve. Suppose you started out in the 10th place. Now the best you can do is to go to first place, which means only a difference of 9 points in rank. So the best countries don't have much of a chance to do very well according to this change in rank procedure. But that's fine, because our goal is to find out how to make improvements. The countries which were already very good in 1960 are not going to tell us the things we need to do to improve our infant mortality. So this bias towards badly ranked countries in the beginning is not harmful for the purpose that we are doing the ranking. Now we're going to look graphically at the performance of all of the top 10 countries. So here's the top country, and it starts out to 20, and for the sake of reference we have put the 3 quartiles, the Q3, the median, and the Q1, And we see that it starts out, the Maldives start out at the worst and then ends up near Q1 or Q2 in the end. You can't really see because of the scale. So in order to improve the visibility, we redo the plot starting from 1990. That reduces the scale, and then you see that it goes to the line of the first quartile. It means it goes from being the worst, 193 rank, to the 25th quartile, which would be around 22 or so. So it becomes the 22nd, 23rd ranked country in 2018. So this is the performance of the best country in terms of change in ranking. Now this is very interesting because Maldives is not a very rich country, so whatever strategies they followed are things that would be worth emulating, worth looking at how they did this. It is a small country, so it may not be applicable to big countries, but anyway, the next step, the data has given us a clue as to what we need to look at. Now we need to go and look at the ground reality in Maldives. How did they achieve such a great reduction in infant mortality? We have to look at their health systems and the strategies they used and so on. Another thing that's worth noting is that it reached the top quartile but didn't go below that. And this is an illustration of the Pareto principle or the 80-20 principle. It says that 80% of the change is easy to make and the last 20% is hard to do. So getting to the top quartile top 25% is good. And then making even more improvement might require much more effort. So Oman starts at the same place and ends at the same place as Maldives. The trajectory is rather different. Oman has a very rapid decrease from 1960 to 78. Over 18 years, they go from the worst to the first percentile at 25%. But after that, they follow the first percentile trajectory. As opposed to this, Maldives takes the whole period to achieve 25th percentile. This sharp decline over a period of 18 years probably reflects the effect of oil wealth, but that's not all. Many countries had oil wealth and they did not do as well. So the oil wealth was used well in the health sector. So we can learn something from Oman over the period 60 to 78. But after that period, Oman's does decrease, but it is following the general trend globally, and so there is no special effect to be learned from Oman in this period after 78. Here's a comparison of countries 3 and 4. Turkey and Libya both start out being pretty bad, and then they both go to almost near the first quartile, just like the countries that we have studied, Oman and the first country. So if you look at the performance curves, you see that Libya did a very rapid decline and Turkey has a much more gradual decline. Libya reaches the median curve, the gray curve, around 1978, whereas Turkey reaches the median around 2002. So Libya does a very rapid decrease in the early period and then not so good later on. These numbers are something of a mystery because Libya was completely destroyed. It was carpet bombed in 2011. The government was destroyed and the beautiful social security system they had set up were completely destroyed, and the government is in chaos and shambles. So infant mortality should actually have gone up in the Libya, but we see that it has been going down smoothly since 2011. Apparently the war didn't affect it. Much more likely there is something wrong with the data, and if you look at the figures and if you look at the explanations in the tables, they say that when they don't have data they use models to estimate, and so the models, they don't explain what they are, but it is very likely that the models are coming up with the wrong answers because the models don't take into account that there is a war that flattened Libya. Here's the curve for Bahrain, which shows that Bahrain went from the third quartile to the first quartile very rapidly from 1960 to 75, and since 75 it had more or less followed the bottom quartile. So the time to study Bahrain is from 60 to 75. After that, it basically followed the general trend in all countries. So it was doing nothing very special. All the countries were improving, and Bahrain was improving along with them on the quartile curve according to the standard trend at its level. So this means that it was doing nothing very special, nothing very exceptional. All of the countries in that range were doing similar performances. So this graph also tells us that we need to look at, if we want to study what Bahrain did, it is only in 1960 to 75 that we will see something exceptional. After 75, Bahrain follows the standard trajectory. So what do we learn from this data analysis? We learned that data provide us with clues about the real world. Knowledge comes from following up these clues. If we go and study what happened in Turkey and the health systems in Oman and the other good performing countries, then in Maldives, then we might find out how we can lower the infant mortality. We might say that Oman, for example, is an oil-rich country, but not all oil-rich countries are showing up here. So when you use the wealth in the right ways to reform your health system, then you will get good results for infant mortality. But what are the right ways? For that, we need to go and look at the actual health policies followed. So basically, knowledge comes from following up the clues that are generated by the data and looking at the real world events. For example, in Libya, we saw that the data doesn't seem plausible because of the NATO attack. So one of the things is that data by themselves are never enough to provide knowledge. You have to look at data in conjunction with the real world. So we have a few concluding remarks. Fisherian statistics is about reducing the data to a few numbers. You take all of the data and you try to summarize it using sufficient statistics. After you have these few numbers, you don't need the data anymore. In real statistics, every data point is individually significant and important. And so every point, we look at Korea and what it did in 1970 and what it did in 1972. And if these are different, that's something to look at. Every data point is important and meaningful. This is very different from Fisherian statistics. We have learned that rankings require purpose, and for one purpose we did this ranking. If we use proportional change, this will also give us something similar, and even absolute change gave us some reasonable numbers. So even that was not totally off. So proportional might throw up some new countries, so we can look at that. There is no unique method which must be followed. We are trying to look for clues, and clues can come up in different ways of looking at the same data. Finally, we must look at data in conjunction with the real world. When we looked at Libya and then we looked at the real world, we saw that the data must be wrong. It cannot really be representing the reality of Libya. That led us to investigate the data and find out that it's being estimated from a model, and that model is probably wrong because it's probably not taking into account the war destruction created in Libya. It's probably following some simple pattern. So data analysis must be done in conjunction with reality in the real world.